Welcome to Getting to Know You. Today is the second installment of recognizing women who are part of our recent history, and they're here at Stonebridge. I'm delighted to be in Barbara Figge Fox's house where the Buttons live, and also where the tree is lit up at night in her backyard, welcoming us back in the dark. So if you live on the west side, you see it all the time. If you live on the east side, take a ride and make sure that you get a chance to enjoy it too. Also, I think when I say her name, many of you will connect it with the Buttons or the Button Club, but it goes much further than that. Barbara, and I'm going to ask her how she got the buttons, but I think one of the things that happens when a person tells you about why something is important to her or him, you begin to appreciate it in a different way, and you start getting curious about it. And I think that's what we've seen happen here at Stonebridge, but I'm going to ask you some more about that. So, Barbara, just tell us, where did the Buttons come from? We're going to start with that, and then we'll go into your story that is part of women's history as I see it.
So the Buttons came from my grandmother, who began collecting in the very early days when button began to be a hobby. She wore a corset every day of her life, and for money she used the tips she got from my grandfather, who had a wedding business. He was a justice of the peace, and she would sit over in her corner and put her hand out and say, "Dawson," when he came up from doing a wedding, and he would give her the tip, and with that she bought her buttons. It was an extensive collection. Women there were club members, and she was an active member of various clubs, and she went around giving talks, and so I'm continuing that tradition.
So she really started the tradition in a way, because she did it so early.
She was one of the pioneers.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. And is that the grandmother that was also the daughter of
Yes, she grew up.
slaveholders?
She grew up in the South, and her father had a plantation, and I openly say, I am the great granddaughter of a person who had enslaved persons, and this is something that I deal with. Yes.
I have to be honest about it. There really were such people.
Yes. Yes.
Well, we're going to skip ahead a little bit in your story, if you don't mind. But I see your story being a story that was repeated often, that we still think about today, and that is, you're a child. If you're a woman, you're a child. In your teenage years, some time was invested in you. You learned to appreciate poetry. There were some women who were athletically inclined, but it wasn't something that women or young women did. And then you went to college, and there was always that expectation that at college you would meet your husband.
Right.
Because probably the most important thing that would happen after you got out of college was that you would get married.
Absolutely. You needed to graduate with a ring on your finger.
Right. And then you oversaw the growth and development of your children, and helped your husband get further in business.
Absolutely.
And then you were 40, and then what did you do with your life?
Well, I was...
Now we can take this a little bit. Let's
Right.
say your childhood was in a cosmopolitan place, right?
Yes. I grew up in Baltimore. I had every possible lesson that could possibly be given, including dance. Ice skating was the only sport, piano, everything. And so I was well prepared to go in many different directions. And at age 36, I began to realize that I needed to make some money. And it took me 10 years to figure out how to do that with a full-time job. I was fortunate enough to have to be married to my high school sweetheart. Went to West Point. I thought I would be a general's wife, but he got out of the Army, so then I was an IBM wife. And so I started to try to be a freelance writer.
Well, let's stop there, because
Okay.
when we had our little pre-conversation, and I said, so, well, what did you do when you went to Duke? Because you were in the South
Right.
at Duke when it was still a women's college. That was another thing. Most women went to college that
Right.
were somehow labeled colleges for women. So
That's right. I went to Duke when it was a women's college, and I didn't fit in very well there. I went to kind of get to know what it was like to be a Southerner, and I wasn't. Was very much a Yankee, and but I found my little tribe at Duke. It was with the dance club, and I spent 3 of my 4 years at Duke mostly dancing, mostly making dances, and having a wonderful time doing that. I studied, yes, but Duke was a time when I loved making dances, and I was pretty serious about it.
Well, now wait a minute. There also was an interest in writing at Duke, right?
I studied English, but I might have gone on to get my master's in English, but I had this ring on my finger from my high school sweetheart, and so and we got married 3 weeks after we graduated, so there was no pursuing English as a career.
All right, but you did tell me about something you wrote that you were very proud of, that you basically taught yourself how to write. It was a person who became famous. She wasn't was she famous at the time?
Oh, I see what you mean. So I got my entree into getting my first published piece because Elizabeth Liddy Hanford had gotten married the year before in 1975, and in 1976 her new husband was nominated for the vice presidential nomination for the Republican Party. And I'd been trying to break into publishing for several years and not having any success whatsoever.
So you were doing writing while you were dancing.
Well, right. Well, this was in the 30s. I decided to be a writer. So I decided, Barbara, if you can't get a published piece out of this, you'd better try some other way of making money. And so I did. I got an article published in the Baltimore Sun about Elizabeth Dole, and I never needed another journalism credit, and I never had a journalism credit. You just learn by doing.
But it's stuck in your mind that you had a successful piece that you could say it's published and it's about a famous person. How about that?
Right.
So as you went along, you had children.
I had 3 children.
And you kept writing.
From my 30s on, when the youngest was about 3 years old, I kept writing for 10 years. I was kind of entrepreneurial because I managed to publish dance pieces. So I figured out as a freelance writer I needed to have a specialty in order to make any money. So I would write 4 or 5 articles about the same dance company. I would go to the performance in Philadelphia and then phone ahead to the newspapers where they were going and convince them they wanted for $25 to buy my article on them.
And did you get a press pass?
No, we didn't have it. The only thing I could use for a press pass was a reporter's notebook. If you have a reporter's notebook, you could get in anywhere.
That's that skinny thing that spiral bound.
Right.
So you kept doing that. But where were you living then at that time?
I was living in Philadelphia and then in Pittsburgh, and then we moved to Princeton. And as soon as we got to Princeton, I ended up being the dance correspondent for the then called the Trenton Times.
And I remember reading your stories and seeing your byline because I was sort of interested in dance as entertainment, sort of, what was going on in town. But then I started seeing your name in other places. Right?
Well, after about 5 years, I got tapped by the guy who founded US One newspaper, Rich Ryan.
He's the man that wrote the book about Holly White and spoke here at Stonebridge.
Right. And so after 10 years of working, making very little money, actually, I was worth more to the family as an income tax deduction than by my earnings. But Rich hired me, and I ended up working full-time for him for 23 years. And everything that I'd ever done in my life, everything, whether it was all the lessons that I took that I knew a little bit about, or the dance, or the years I spent reading my husband's business magazines, that all came together, and it was my dream job. And my husband had kind of put up with my not being able to contribute to the family income for quite a long while. said that he had prayed for years that I would get my dream job, and it was indeed, because I was working for a really smart guy, and I recommended everybody try to work for somebody who's smarter than you are, because then you won't be frustrated.
But you also caught on to how to get to the heart of many different kinds of people. I guess that's really from your background, from your husband being in business and so on, scientists and so on. I think we really should pay a little bit more tribute to Rich, because he invented a newspaper for a region.
Yes.
And was actually famous in that business of local publishing. And it was free, which was another thing.
It was very inventive, and some people didn't get it, and the people that didn't get it didn't stay long.
Of course, we get it here.
Well, no, what I mean is, they didn't get the concept, because he used to say it's free. It's not really free because the readers pay with their time. And another,
that's interesting.
Another big principle was everybody's in Princeton. This was a reason why we could succeed. All the companies want to feel like they're in Princeton. So our mantra was never identify anybody as being from Ewing, Lawrence, Plainsboro, whatever. It was always what office park they were in. Another mantra was that it needed to be a water cooler kind of paper where people would talk about what they had in common, not about municipalities. Thank God we didn't have to do municipal government. We didn't have to do school systems. We just did what everybody was interested in.
But very often that would be focusing on a certain topic or a certain initiative. When the watershed, then known as the Stony Brook Millstone Watershed, expanded and started a farm in addition to preserving land, I remember that it was a terrific article. I think maybe you wrote it, to try to explain what a nonprofit could do, and that was of regional service too.
So one of the things that helped us to do that was, first it was monthly, then bi-weekly, then weekly. And Rich's way of editing was to let the story go, put everything in it you could, and he would make space for it. And so that allowed us to go do magazine depth articles, whether they were from a freelancer or from a staff person, and really go into it.
Yeah, I can remember both reading stories in US 1 and then deciding that you wanted to make copies for other people. So you cut up the paper, and the story would go on one side and then the other side, and the columns wouldn't be quite even and so on, so that you would be putting together a puzzle in order to send it out to other people.
It was a graphic disaster, and that was all right because it was a writer's paper. However, from 1996 on, you could get that on the web.
I was going to ask you about that. You were the one that did it. How did you know how to do that?
So I don't take credit for the technology. Rich hired a techno person who came in and said, why do you want to do this? And he set up something. So in the early days, it was a template. You just put it in the template, put some fancy stuff on the top, do a little bit of programming, and throw it up there for everybody to read, because as we know, it was free. Yeah.
And I think that was the first newspaper that people seemed to be comfortable going online to read. I mean, you'd hear about people talking about that way before it was the Star Ledger, or even the Trenton Times. I don't know, this Trenton Times online yet.
Yes, and we picked the name Princeton Info, which didn't please the other newspapers around who had Princeton in their name, because US 1 wouldn't work, Route 1 wouldn't work, because you wouldn't know how to spell it.
Oh, okay. I've always wondered about that, so now I know. So you kept doing that. So you were a pioneer. And it also,
Rich was a pioneer, and I enabled it. Yes.
Well, but he needed somebody like you to make it work.
Yes.
And out of that, I think you got a real identity in the region. You didn't get a master's in something and could say to people, I'm a social worker or something. But once you got yourself established at US 1, you were a journalist and a professional, and the reviews of dance and other performances and orchestras and so on really became something that people wanted.
Right. When we started out, it was a monthly, and I did both the arts and business. And I found out that interviewing a dancer is the same thing as interviewing an entrepreneur. It's basically their story. When we went bi-weekly, we needed to hire somebody. It was easier to find an arts person than a business person, so we hired the arts person. And then we went monthly. We had a wonderful array of folks, people like Nicole Plett, who really threw herself into it just as much as just as much as I did, because you really had to be very loyal and very hardworking. They were not 40-hour weeks. They were not.
Well, to put out a paper like that. But then there's another part of your career that I think is often what women do, and that you became interested in nonprofit work, putting your leadership into doing good, and I think part of that came from your family. And
so there's several strains with that. Once is in my teens, I was a really avid Girl Scout, and my troop went to Europe.
Everybody listen who was a Girl Scout and see if you
I
can identify what a patrol is, right?
I went to the first, I was one of 2 patrols from Baltimore to go to the first ever Girl Scout roundup. We had 2 patrols in my troop that went to Europe when troops didn't do that. And I was so invested in that I wanted to give back. So I had, in my 20s, I had senior Girl Scout troops and so on and so on. So that was the first half of my life, indeed. After I retired from US 1, I put my time into Not in Our Town, which my cousin Anya Sahara was very active in, and I wanted to spend time with her. And that was based on church work that I'd done in my 20s and 30s with Redeemer Moravian Church, which was a racial justice oriented church during the civil rights era in the 60s and 70s. And so I had that experience, and then contributed something to Not in Our Town, not as much as other people, but I was able to start their website, actually.
Thank you. And Not in Our Town now still is a very robust organization that the library carries their meetings through Zoom every month, I think, on a Monday night, where they address seriously issues that are related to racial justice mainly, but it's very clear that even in Princeton we have a problem, and we're not going to forget that. That's why it's not in our town, and what are we doing and what do we need to do?
So we used to say, when somebody says, oh, Princeton is so liberal, there's no problem here, and the answer to that is, if you say that, you must be white. Which is a kind of a rude thing to say back, but oh well.
Yeah.
And Not in Our Town is, the continuing conversation started out as just, 6 people around a table. And then it became, the board shifted from being church-based to anybody could be on it. And now it's just a very thriving nonprofit.
Right.
Yeah.
And it has become really a close partner with much of the research that's going on in this area that's related to Black Lives Matter, to the history of the impact of slavery itself and its impact. And it's amazing that it really is open to anyone who knows where the Zoom address is at the Princeton Library.
It's a wonderful way to educate yourself and to deal with questions you have, and it offers an opportunity after the speaker speaks, then there's an opportunity to go into small groups and practice saying things that you want to be able to say.
Right. And so let's end up with the buttons, because the buttons do say something about our lives, and that's probably as interesting as the buttons themselves artistically, although I find that interesting, or from a manufacturing, how could you possibly make that? But when I visited with the Button Club, you were passing around one of your display cards that showed famous women,
Yes.
leaders. And I wondered today if we would make buttons with famous leaders, women leaders that we're thinking of. I mean, we have things that are, what do you call them? The buttons that you put on your
Yeah, the political, the pin on buttons, right, yes.
But
uh-huh.
not thought out, carefully crafted, respectful buttons. So maybe someday we should have a round table and say, now, if you could make a button of an important person, who would it be?
So we could do that, but artists are making buttons today, and so we could commission that, absolutely, yes.
Well, you always have to have something else to do. Keep the tree lit.
And come to our button meetings if you want to find out. It's a place to enjoy each other's
I
company.
think Jock actually has a strip of buttons for this program all ready to go. So thank you so much for sharing your life and giving us another way of understanding women in history.
It is such fun to talk with you.
Well, I enjoyed talking with you.
It's wonderful.
Thank you. Listen, again, we have number 3 coming up in Women's History Month.